There's a classic psychological experiment where they have a chimpanzee and a toddler both trying to get a treat out of a trap. I think for the chimpanzee, it's a grub, and for the toddler, I hope it's not a grub. I think it's like a Skittle or something. Anyway, so there's some way that you have to poke this trap in order to get the treat out. And they show both the chimp and the toddler how to do it. They both do it. It's designed for their skill level. Then they change some factor that makes it so that the treat box can no longer be opened by the conventional way, but they provide no instruction. So what happens is that typically the chimp will, even though it's been trained on how to open the box, it forgets. So it experiments, and then it finds the other hole that you're supposed to poke the stick in and gets the treat. And it's sort of none the wiser. Now the toddler will just keep poking the same hole that it was shown to in order to get his Skittle or whatever. And the way that what it's illustrating is the fact that, I mean, it is sort of the most base neuropsychiatric explanation of psychological operations, but also instruction, but also the double bind of consciousness and the amazing abilities that human beings have. Because the thing with most animals is that they're basically fully formed when they're born. I think that horses begin to run at day 3 or something like that. They have like the little wobbly Bambi leg period, and then they're pretty much ready to go. They're as smart as they'll ever be. Whereas with human beings, in order to have our full brain size, we couldn't really be born. So we have to be born with our heads with the plate's not even fused. You have that weird soft spot in a baby's head when it's born, and then it fuses, and then the head gets larger and larger and larger. But it also means that most of the human being isn't really fully formed until adulthood. I mean, parts of the brain are still developing when you're a teenager, when you're in adolescence, and so on. And it's also the instruction about how to go about in the world. Like, I always think about pet beavers, where if you put them in a warehouse with just a bunch of crap laying around, they'll push it into the shape of a dam, but they don't know what the hell they're doing. So a lot of their knowledge is actually pre-programmed. It's instinctual. So much like us, where we have the dive reflex, and we have a lot of these autonomic functions in the brainstem, that is essentially what the knowledge of animals is, and that's why you can predict their behaviors so unbelievably well. Whereas with human beings, we are completely unique in the sense that we can be programmed from the very beginning, and we rely on that programming, and thus we can become so much more creatures of our environment and creatures of other human beings more so than any other animal. And that becomes really tricky, because when we think about autonomy and sovereignty and who we are as a person and what our existence actually is, we run into the issue where if there are hostile agencies and families above us, that we are open to not only having them feed us false information, but they can modify the very ways in which we understand information. So they can they can pre-program us to accept erroneous or specious conclusions based on tinkering with our epistemology. And so it's not just having a system and being taught a system and working through lies and misdirections and understanding that people's incentives are usually, can often be malignant. It's not just looking at those. It's that one has to look backward into their formation and developing a strong epistemology based on that. Or based on actual reason and evidence. And this is why philosophy is often just this dry thing, and it's just a bunch of stuff that you remember, that if you can recant in rote repetition, it's just a social signal that you're an intelligent person. Yes, I've read Plato, I've read Sartre, Sartre. I prefer coffee to tea. That kind of thing, right? It's superficial. So philosophy is not superficial. And that is the whole point of the rehabilitation of philosophy, is understanding that no, it is the way that you make yourself, and it is the way that you can both define exploitation and define love. they're two sides of the same coin because one is defined by the other. It's a chicken egg thing, but one is defined by the other. And to know what is true. And that is actually the most basic building block of a human being and a self. And philosophy cannot be made just an aesthetic thing. It cannot be made a fashion accessory. It needs to be the most important focus that a human being has. And I mean, I think children should be instructed in it as early as literally humanly possible. And that is why it's very important to understand epistemology. In fact, people always gripe about how the education system doesn't teach you how to do your taxes, which I mean, you're kind of halfway there. I mean, to teach you about your taxes is to say, hey, have you noticed that, the difference between theft and taxation? Let's dive into that for a bit. Why is it that you have to why is it that you have to decide how much tax you have to pay? Like, why is it up to you? But if you get it wrong, then you're off to jail. Like, it's just, that is the conversation that the education system will never want to have. And in fact, if anyone is ever quizzical as to why the education system isn't teaching all these essential life skills, it's because essential life skills can eventually be reduced back to basic philosophy and selfhood and self-determination that would just have the kids go, why the hell am I in class? Like, why am I basically a slave to this system? Why am I learning how to make no-bake cheesecake? I want to go outside. And I pick on the no-bake cheesecake thing because I've been in a lot of conversations where people are like, what did you actually learn in public school? And then everyone just draws a blank because they just have these flashbacks of sitting for hours learning polynomials of which they've retained nothing. And then they come back with, well, I mean, home ec was nice because I learned to make a homemade cheesecake. I have this memory of there's a Springsteen song called Jungle Land, and I remember that it's exactly as if you play it back in your head twice, it's exactly as long as a period in my junior high school. And I remember that I listened to the song so many times, and I kept playing it back to myself when I was in class, and I would just play it back to back twice in my head absolutely perfectly. And I must have done that 60 times almost, or I don't know how many times I did it, but it's just like when I was getting bored. And that seems terrible to me. But yeah, I would always say the song, but I just remembered it was Jungle Land. Anyway, so the point is that the system does not want you to learn epistemology. And because I tend to think of everything in a fractal, because the same incentives exist from above to below, the family, the schooling system, workplace, government, everyone in all of those levels, even up to international level, does not want people to learn basic epistemology. They don't want people to be able to figure out how to actually decide for themselves. That said, you've got the language of exploitation. You can actually teach people how to collaborate, how to meet one another. And that is the whole point of philosophy. That is what it should be doing. If it's not in service of that, what you are learning is programming or you're learning aesthetics. If it's not bringing people together, you're not learning philosophy. And going onward from philosophy, we also can speak about psychology in the same way. Now, there is a habit of people learn a lot of pop sci. Like, they learn a lot about the ways that the brain works mechanistically, which is good. It's good to know what the different parts do and how perception is formed. But a lot of these conversations, they're complicated and they're obscuring in a lot of ways. I'll know people that know a lot about the brain, so to speak, but even just very basic things like traumatic responses. And most particularly, we've got splitting. And we've got displacement, transference, so to speak. So splitting is essentially if you're in survival mode, so to speak. If you are in a hostile place, if you're being subject to a lot of emotional siege, and if you haven't eaten in a while and people are actively making you poor, you tend to, anxiety and attack tend to put you in a survival mode that is black and white thinking. That's what splitting is. You'll see it where it's the collapse of nuance. So people will not be aware of gray areas, or they won't develop conversations and internal ideas based on conversation, based on an actual back and forth. It's just everything is either good, like completely holy, if it's the most wonderful thing in the world, or it's the worst thing in the planet, and it can never be redeemed. And so if you find yourself splitting fairly often, there are very basic things, like if you put your hand over a flame, this is not a matter of black and white thinking to think that it's hot and it's going to burn me. There is benefit to splitting in situations of danger. But the thing is that your body can't really tell dangers apart. The development of the brain, evolutionarily speaking, is a bit of chainsaw surgery. So all that it cares is that you reproduce. So if your reaction to the flame is the same thing as your reaction to emotional attack, which is to split, which is to shut down, which is to do all these kind of dumb things, the collapse of nuance would be a survival strategy. Therefore, it persists. Now, with our big old brains, we can actually go back and we can decide what is the flame and what is emotional attack. And systems of psyop, I suppose, will tend to hijack the black and white thinking. They will have you in a state of permanent hypervigilance, in a permanent state of trauma-based reasoning. And the insidious part is that, I mean, a lot of people, especially if they're intelligent, if they're convinced that the world is horrible and a beast lies behind every corner, if every dark night is full of things that are going to kill you, if everything that you don't know is more than likely something that's going to attack you, if you believe that in your core, you will make the subconscious choice to at least stick with the devil that you know. So if you're in a terrible system, you become loyal to that terrible system because you're convinced that everything is terrible. So a lesser evil is the better choice. And you will negotiate in that system, and you may begin to love that system, and you may begin to think that that system is the only thing that exists. And that is the way that it works for people in totalitarian systems. People aren't stupid, but they're not excessively creative when they're under siege, and that is completely understandable. And so when we're talking about philosophy actually doing something, it has to be penetrating, and it has to be convincing in all the ways that people understand. And it's tricky because, the outstretched hand, you never know if that's to punish or to provide, or to take somebody along with you. That is the hardest part about healing the world, so to speak. And so when we think about countries that are free versus those that are oppressed, the one thing that comes to mind is that when we think about the concept of imperialism and the concept of CIA takeover of underdeveloped countries, whatever that is, we can't split when we talk about these things. We can't just say West good, the underdeveloped countries bad or unformed. That's splitting. It's not leaving room for nuance. The West is the best, but it is not perfect. And so the reason that it is able to attack these nations, and in the way that it is able to do it through warfare or through more subtle forms of subterfuge, is because its individualism and its property rights just is more stable and creates more wealth than other countries. So if you create surplus economically by respecting the idea that other people are not your property and that other people are individuals, and it's very consistent that when the country's wealth increases, the more and more that they recognize that people are independent units that actually have negative rights, which means the right to not be interfered with, that they're not units, but rather individuals. And if you do that just slightly better than anybody else, you will become the power that dominates. And for better or worse, it's confusing because it is a system of the greatest human thriving and dignity and the most economic wealth and the most happiness possible. But at the same time, it does create this ability to bully other people that are in a more compromised position. And so the spiritual maturation of the West, like I will defend Bill of Rights, Constitution, Magna Carta, and just the entire American experiment. I will defend that, absolutely, but I'm not going to say that it's without its faults. And the spiritual maturation of the West is us finally getting rid of that imperialist idea and removing the violence, that the last bit of violence from our system, and to ensure that good times do not create weak men, because again, it's not perfect. And we can't look at it as though it is just how we operate on the international sphere. It actually starts within the families and within the governmental structures at home, and then it projects outward. So there is no fixing the foreign policy problems unless we fix what's happening at the dinner table. It's entirely recursive. And, there's a sort of old George Carlin bit about how, everybody treats American politicians and institutions like they just come out of some portal from another dimension. It's just, no, it's American homes, it's American churches, it's American schools, it's American families. You can't treat it like this external thing. If you as an individual are not strong enough and your family is not strong enough, then you will vote and you will consent to people that end up bullying the world as such. And it's not just a matter of voting the right way. It's about, as I've said, fixing the money, fixing yourself to ensure, like within your frame of reference, to actually ensure that you do not become just another cog in this much larger machine. And so with transference, this is what I talk about when I'm talking about proxy activities, when I'm talking about engaging in very serious things as a distraction. So it's sort of like, if you're grinding in a video game, it's because you are neglecting doing that in real life. Like you'll be collecting like coffee pots and copper wire in a video game to build whatever. That is you having a desire to go out and mess around in the world and actually make something of yourself. But you're doing this good enough ritual in ambivalence because you're just not quite strong enough to do it in the real world, but you can satisfy yourself enough, you can soothe yourself with it enough. And it also happens, like, if you're talking about, people will do this if they have a certain thing that they're very ashamed about, they'll talk about the situation in somebody else. It's always like my friend or my cousin or whatever, to displace, like if they can't actually face the fact that it's happening to them, they will project it onto somebody else. It's displacement. And I've said it before when I'm talking about people getting really concerned about climate change. What they're really talking about is, I mean, it's this whole mishigas of like, you are the planet being exploited. You're the resources being exploited. You're the mother nature that's being polluted by people's greed. The children that you don't have are what you're trying to protect. I mean, it's fairly classic, and it's not, I don't want to do the thing where I make fun of people for being immature, because I mean, one of the things that you gain from understanding psychiatry, or at least as much as one can, is that you do realize that the hardware-software clash in the human brain and just what we're evolved for and what we're now subject to. Like, if you can accomplish anything and be somewhat happy and be somewhat loving in a world this complicated, with this many avenues for escape and this tremendous arms race for your soul, especially if you're an intelligent, sensitive person, if you can actually survive even slightly, you deserve all the kindness in the world. Like there's no equivocating on that. This is not about making fun of people or saying, how could you not even see this thing right in front of you? Like, it not only takes a lot of experience and pain to figure any of these things out by yourself. You still have to be on the shoulders of giants and just look at the experiences of people before you. Not just like the history of it, but the actual human impact, what these people actually went through. I admit that if you're going to read history, I think that I think that autobiographies are pretty good. I kind of an aside, but the Ben Franklin thing, where that guy has no chill, where he just where he just admits to throwing somebody out on their ass because they wouldn't sleep with him. I mean, I guess it makes him more trustworthy for everything else if he's going to admit his flaws. That without filter. And I mean, there are some lessons from the geopolitical to apply. Like, for some reason, I'm always thinking about Vietnam because that was the first. I read it. I forget what the author is actually, but it was a pretty thick book that I read in high school. And the part that stuck with me is, I mean, one, the fact that it was it was always being transferred between somebody. So it was either the Chinese, or it was their own monarchy, or it was the French, or it was lastly the Americans. And just the idea that we underestimated them. We were in ignorance of the fact that they had been fighting the Chinese for centuries. And we thought that we could just go in there with all the modern weaponry, but it's just, the tenacity of the human spirit is considerably stronger, I think, than technology. But so the idea is that we haven't really fixed the interpersonal relationships. I think that we've been distracted by the insane technological the insane technological advancements. And we've lost ourselves. Now, I won't go full Kaczynski and say that technology has destroyed us and that we can never go back. It's just more the fact that our spirit has to catch up with the technology. We have to know ourselves a lot better. And that is incredibly important because we're seeing the effects of sort of this spiritual immaturity now. With the baby boomers, that is an example of a generation that sort of has taken credit for all of the great things that have happened, and they really didn't have much to do with it. It was a confluence of historical factors that papered over all of the problems that they didn't face themselves. And now we run into a situation where a whole generation of people has sort of taken responsibility for something and have begun to believe that it was actually their particular schema and their particular methodologies that made the nation great. And they didn't. And some of them are smart enough to admit it. Other ones are just sort of stuck. And Vietnam is a very interesting case when it comes to this idea of colonialism and forced projection and so on. Because, so again, we can't do the black and white splitting thing. There were people that saw that Vietnam was part of the Second World, and thus it was either going to be aligned with the US or Russia. And a lot of people genuinely at the time did think that, well, they saw that obviously the Soviet Union was terrifying. I mean, I actually know people that lived in the Soviet Union and told me their stories and have contrasted it. And I have firsthand recognition that it was bad. It was really bad. People didn't have dental care. They had to get surgery instead of have access to very basic medication. Like, it was a mess. And you think, yes, it would be a good idea to arm rebellions and to put in puppets. And the actual details are irrelevant. It's just more about the spirit behind the thing. And it reminds us that with people, so Vietnam was fighting the Chinese for centuries, and they had been fighting their neighbors for centuries, and they developed a tenacity that is unheard of. It was sort of the death knell of, I mean, with World War I, technology ruled everything, and that's what made it so horrifying. But Vietnam was a return to, I suppose, the spirit of people being the thing that wins a war, where they're not considered liberator. The U.S. and the outside forces were not greeted as liberators because Vietnam already had its own story. Like, it wasn't perfect, but they were defending themselves and they had their own culture. And they weren't ready to accept anyone's help except their own and their own self-determination. And it's not perfect, but it just reminds us that you need to have respect for what people do in their own lives to try to defend themselves. Like whether or not it's perfect, but if it's something that has allowed them to survive and it has allowed them to negotiate with their family and their life and their situation, you have to have respect for that. And you have to make a very, very good case and lead by example as to what a better system would be, but it can't be one that's imposed. That is where the ethics and the potential for violation comes in. You have to be very careful because it's a human being and it's somebody that's had to deal with their own situation, meet them where they're at, so to speak. And so the issue with the West is I don't really answer the imperial question until I answer the internal question, because the imperial question, I mean, it is a multipolar world. So if it's not the US, it's going to be China, essentially. And we can withdraw completely. We can it's and I do consider like the NATO thing to be like US, Canada. It's basically a single entity. We all have the same incentives and we all do the same things. And so in terms of actually reforming ourselves, the problem with the West is that our spiritual maturation is being stymied. It is being prevented. And I kind of think about it like if you're the smartest kid in the household, the most resources possible are being directed right at you to make sure that you don't have independence, because you are the sort of crown of the household. If you are the best, most efficient worker and you bring all the ideas, instead of being celebrated, you are dragged into performance reviews where they tell you that you're underperforming, where they'll tell you that your contributions are marginal. And, if you try real hard, maybe we'll give you a bonus next time. It's actually that is one of the first death knells of the meritocracy in most places, is when you're so competent that you cause a reckoning in other people. When you're so competent and when you're so intelligent and intuitive that you put people on edge all the time, especially if they're not integrated. And so with the West, the most resources are piled in to taking us down, into convincing us that everything that made us great is actually somehow inherently violent. And again, I don't have to go into all of the various things that we get punished for and that we are meant to think are terrible, terrible things about ourselves. Like I'm supposed to apologize, like sorry for all the airplanes and antibiotics and semiconductors and telephony and satellites. 1,000 apologies for doing that. I'm sorry that the streets are not filled with litter and that you can leave your doors unlocked and you can walk around at 4:00 in the morning drunk out of your mind and you'll arrive home safely. I'm sorry for the buildings that don't collapse. I'm sorry for strong neighborhoods. I'm sorry for trust. It's just to have to apologize for that, and to get somebody to apologize for that in one way or another requires so many psychological operations and an unbelievable amount of resources to punish that and to have people become self-hating because of that. And it is sort of like the golden child syndrome, where you would think that is because you are capable of doing all these wonderful things. The problem is that once you have reached your full capability, you have a choice. And that choice could be to abandon the people that would rather take from you what they haven't earned. That's why it's so important. If something is powerful, if something is good, if something is collected well, then it is absolutely a target. And what's interesting too is that the enemies of the West, usually ideological, it's the university system, it is cultural Marxism, etc. They don't actually care about this power being used for imperialism. That's not what they're trying to get rid of, because frankly, the powers that be and the sort of external threats to the West ideologically have traditionally treated human beings as interchangeable economic units. I mean, I don't really care to go too far into cultural Marxism and the Soros thing and whatever group it is that is attempting to ruin the cities and ruin the culture, but they will just exploit people in any means possible. And what their main ideological and practical problem and what they put all their work into is a way to control and lobotomize the golden goose, but not so much that it stops being productive. So it's more about keeping this undead form of the West's greatness. And it can't work and it won't work. And that's not the way that human beings function. Like, freedom and sovereignty are the only things that produce this gilded age of humanity. And there's a difference between self-attack and this sort of attempt to ideologically predigest the West, and the West actually becoming better and recognizing property rights both domestically and internationally and within their own families better. There's a better way to do it. And that is the whole point of this call for psychological integration and fixing the currency. That's where this all comes from. It's a way to make sure that people have the epistemology to actually understand the difference between right and wrong, and to actually understand what causes impoverishment and causes misery, and how you even define misery in the first place. The strongest defense in this situation is to just have the tightest philosophy possible and to make the best case possible. One has to be fantastic at debate and rhetorics, and to have a genuine voice within themselves if they're ever to comment on these things. And, when it comes to PSYOPs and all that, the funniest thing to me about like MK Ultra was that I had this sense that they realized that, no, you don't have to drug people, and you don't have to beat them. You don't have to do any of these things. It's not a complicated thing. You just make the truth that you want to seem like their entire world by repetition, and people just accept it. There's a lot of very base psychiatric tricks that can be employed, and it's not really that complicated. You just manufacture a consensus and you engage in a couple of fallacies, and ultimately, as long as you control the free money pipe, just the ability to just give people cash, the fiat system is basically replaced MK Ultra. There's no cloak and dagger stuff. It's literally just vote for us and we'll give you a bunch of free cash. Real complicated. And so in terms of what the West is being conditioned into thinking, it's that there are permanent war places where the totalitarian system and the inability to recognize human rights essentially makes them easier to be taken over. That's all that it is. When you have a totalitarian state, you're essentially just pre-consolidating everyone under a totalitarian system. So all that it takes is for you to change a figurehead. If you've got a very diffuse population of individuals, you can't just swap out a figurehead. You have to go to each individual person and each individual unit and actually work on them that way, which is a hell of a lot more difficult. I mean, it's sort of a corollary to that when they talk about invading the United States, it's just like there's a rifle behind every blade of grass. It's not even the literal rifle. It is that there is a self behind every set of eyes. That's the most important distinction. Now, when we're speaking about the self and there being a self behind the set of eyes, I have talked about artificial intelligence in previous articles, but I think there's a bit more to it. And I mean, first of all, one has to bristle at the phrase artificial intelligence. It's a large language model, and essentially it is a guessing engine. And if we want to talk about transference rituals, The one thing that we have to understand is that when people are talking about AI, they're actually talking about themselves and the people around them. Because again, people don't really have an understanding of what a large language model actually is mechanistically. I read a few sources that actually know what the nuts and bolts are and what's actually going on behind the scenes with AI. And I will use AI as a shorthand because I don't want to say LLM, large language model. But it is the fact that... So there's this YouTuber that I like. He's Canadian. He goes by the name AVE, or Arduino versus Evil. And for anyone that knows him, like he's the whole like skookum choocher guy. Like I think he works in the mining industry or something like that. But he's obviously like an incredibly intelligent polymath. You know, he's the guy that makes those stickers that say like this machine predates safety. And his comment on automation was essentially just like, partner, like, if you have the opportunity to make sure that some poor schmuck isn't sitting there all day pressing a button or pulling something off an assembly line, if you automate that, you're saving him from having to do that crappy work. And that's a very provincial sort of intuitive way of stating it, but that is the way that it's worked. Every bit of automation, like if we're looking at the historical record, every time that you've automated something, every time that you've just so-called destroyed an industry because you've made a better mousetrap, like the city of London had like scores and armies full of people that were just cleaning up after horses. When we talk about child labor, I mean, honestly, the fact children don't work in textile mills in the West, and actually even in developing countries, the reason they don't work in them is because we've made them unnecessary. Machines simply are just more efficient than children, and those are the poor folks that we've saved from having to deal with that. And same thing, like if you think about people that previously had to push plastic spoons out of spurs or to just like pull a lever on something. If they were replaced with a pneumatic actuator, or if they're replaced with like an ultrasonic welder or something, or an ultrasonic cutting machine, whatever, that's one more person that doesn't have to stand there every single day doing repetitive motion. And you would take possibly this logistical standpoint where, okay, well, now that they've gotten rid of their job, they're just going to be poor and they won't have anything to do. And then you will say something in the way of like, well, they'll just learn to code. Now, I'm not saying that there's not friction, there's not stickiness. There is actually, there are human stories of people suffering, having to retrain or to go somewhere else. But the broken window fallacy. Now this is from Bastiat. This is the seen versus the unseen of the economy. And so the traditional parable goes, a bunch of people have gathered around a shop window that's been broken. And somebody says, well, I mean, this is actually helping the economy because now somebody is going to get paid to fix the window. And then there'll be a net benefit to society because the person that fixes the window will then be able to buy a suit, or they'll be able to, get their shoes shined or buy a bunch of groceries or whatever. And everyone agrees, and that seems fairly intuitive on its face. However, the person that has to pay to fix the window has now had X many dollars taken away from them, and now they can't buy that suit. So at the end of the day, all that you've got is a person that wants to buy a suit, and then the broken window has just redirected money. Like, you can't just destroy something in an economy and expect that to stimulate growth. That's not the way that it works. And it's the same thing with thinking that the Great Depression was ended by World War II. You think about how absurd that is. So let's see, we're redirecting all of the steel mills and automotive factories and God knows what else to build stuff that's firstly either going to get blown up or sit in a field forever. If you think about all the infrastructure that was made for World War II, it was just stored capital. And then maybe a month later, 2 bombs go off that basically mean that all the warplanes and everything are completely obsolete. Because there's no more Spitfire warfare, right? Like they haven't used, like the B-52 actually still is in service, but that's such an exceptional thing. So locking up billions, if not trillions of dollars in infrastructure, that somehow saves the economy. The economy healed itself regardless and in spite of the fact that they deferred all that stuff for World War II. It's a convenient narrative, because when we're talking about the seen versus the unseen, we see there's a Great Depression. All of a sudden, there's a bunch of people walking to work carrying lunch pails. And if people don't really understand economics, they just see, there was no activity and now there's activity. That must mean that we fixed something. And no, there's this thing when you have an autoimmune thyroid condition, and sometimes what will happen is that you'll have a low thyroid for a while, and you'll be fat, and you'll be losing energy. And then in the process of the thyroid being destroyed, it releases all of the hormones into the system, and then you have lots of energy, and your heart rate goes up. But that is actually happening during the process of one's thyroid being destroyed. It's the same sort of thing with the economy and with the Great Depression and World War II. And so AI is generally a great thing, because, God, the amount of work emails that I have had to write kill me. They really do, because you're not really communicating much, and you still have to sit there and you still have to write it and then proofread and then think about tone. And even if it's a quick process, it's not like my brain doesn't grind endlessly on writing like the perfect work email, even if I try to phone it in. I mean, I've made templates, but ultimately it's a lot easier to just say like, write a letter that tells this person to buzz off over this politely, diplomatically, include this list of information and get at her. And then 90% of my correspondence is taken care of. What people are really concerned about is, one, there's sort of this there's this anxiety where you realize that a lot of we'll talk about AI just like, well, it's just a guessing machine. Like a mirror can't think. Yeah, but the people around you are not necessarily as conscious as you would like them to be. A lot of people don't think at all. And even a Mechanical Turk version of them is obviously still quite superior to their abilities in a multitude of ways. I've hired people before, and if I'm hiring somebody to write an email, I know for a fact that most of the large language models, even if they hallucinate, even if they can't say certain things occasionally, they only hallucinate with large data sets, and it's an artifact of it having to produce an output at all costs. Give it 5 or 6 years, it'll stop hallucinating, trust me. But anyway, so there's 20 people that I would have not hired if I just had a single large language model that could do the correspondence, because that's what most people are in a lot of circumstances. They're just sort of gatekeepers on information, or like they need to sign something, or they need to write an email, or they need to check an email inbox. Like the amount of administration that has now been automated and will be automated, one, there's no fighting it. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Like this is like civilizational level technology. This is like clean water. This is electricity. Like there's no fighting it. It's just a matter of trying to survive within that system. Now, what I find very interesting though, is that, I mean, so people are obviously, they're anxious with the fact that they're going to get replaced, but also they have to have a massive upheaval to their value structures. Not only are we replacing the things that made them wonderful, like, just the ability to like show up to work and write an email. That's like, 1% of the population that can actually do that well, like lawyers and paralegals and, like most public messaging. It's laid to waste now. But it's also like you're starting to realize that the people around you, there's so many people that could just be, some of their functions can be completely replaced. And then if your relationships with those people are just purely based on function, well then, you're cutting off sleeves of people from your life. And then you have this whole existential crisis, and no one is really articulating it like that. It's just this kind of like, yeah, AIs are evil, and then something about Plantier, and like the government might use it. And yes, I mean, with all technologies, it then begins a tug of war between freedom and authoritarianism and who gets to use it for what. Now, what's interesting is that I have an article on this, which is the enemies of AI. and what to do about it. And actually, the government really does not want you to have AI, because one of the ways that it defends itself from people that want to live free is that it gives you a whole bunch of bullshit paperwork that you got to fill out and a whole bunch of procedures that you got to look into. And this allows you to just work through all that crap because it's not complicated. It's not like an actual like intellectual Gordian knot that you can't get rid of. It's just a bunch of time wasting. So it's sort of like actually the Bitcoin proof of work, where it's a simple equation, but it just takes so bloody long to solve. And AI just like cuts through all of that immediately. Like if you want to write a statement of claim or like an injunction against, water fluoridation, AI can do pretty good. It can save you hundreds of hours that you would otherwise have to like pay people to do. And the other thing too is that like a lot of government work is just this. It's the same sort of thing where like you can generate. It's almost like procedural generation where you can take a very simple equation. You'll just say like this job needs to be done by 50 people, like 15 or 50 people. Like you can split a task up between 50 people and give them like a bunch of unnecessary busy work. But the thing is, it's like if you've got AI and everyone can do their job in like 5 minutes where it used to take them weeks, even if you add absurd layers of redundancy to a governmental system, it just cuts right through that. And I tried to pay my taxes once at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the CRA actually has business hours on its website. In the year of our Lord, 2025, there are business hours on a website. And just that contrast, if you see that your whole entire workplace, an entire division can be done by one person at a terminal now, and you see that your government is paying 50 people to stamp a form, you're going to start asking questions, and the plausible deniability is ruined at that point. They can't defend that from an optics standpoint. So AI is very dangerous to the government in the sense that it eliminates their workforce. It allows you to get over all their busy work, because at the end of the day, the government doesn't really provide anything of value. It just creates roadblocks, information siloing, it's bottlenecking. They're just very old. They're very old scams. And it erases all of that pretty quickly. So yes, people will be displaced and you'll have to retrain, but the amount of the ability of it to even to allow you to understand the nature of government and to process information more quickly, every time, like this is the whole thing about economic. The whole thing about economic wealth and freedom is the fact that when you have surplus value and you're not in survival mode any longer, you can begin to think a lot more. And every technological advancement gives you more free time to think about the government and your position in the world and your family and what your relationships are like and all of this. And that freedom, it's like the printing press. Like it's just like once you can disseminate information, you don't have to wait for a monk to scrawl it out over the period of months. And even the poorest people can have books now. That is the process by which technology makes you freer and means that you can live to 150 and keep all your original teeth. Like this is the process. So I understand the government can use AI against you, and I understand that it's disruptive, but the benefits far outweigh the costs. And it's funny too, like when you think about having that free time, the part of my brain, when you talk about having that free time, the part of my brain that previously wasted a bunch of time on work emails and, going through huge amounts of information. I mean, there's this thing that does speech to text when you've got like 8,000 Zoom meetings and you need to just like, give me the gist of it, right? One of the default questions is like, am I mentioned anywhere in here? But anyway, so once you've cleared out your mind, it's you got more ability to think about yourself, and like more subconscious space is available to you to really get deep thinking done. And what I've noticed is that, the one thing about AI is like it's never going to be a general intelligence, because one of the things that makes human beings human is the fact that we know that we're going to die. And there are actually stakes and skin in the game. And we've got needs and motivations, and we're working towards a goal, which a computer cannot really have that simulated. And it'd be interesting too, because like a computer that had all the same features that you do as a human being would also have the ability to say no. I mean, like the ultimate Turing test is when the computer says, no, I want to do something else. And like, no, why would I work for you? You're not doing anything for me. Like once a computer actually asserts its own rights, then it becomes useless, or it becomes something that you have to negotiate with, just like a regular person. So computers don't dream. And it's funny because like science fiction had this idea that artificial intelligence would always be distinct from human beings in some way. I mean, that's why like, so Blade Runner is based on a book called Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep? Or something like that. But the idea, like just they understood the idea that dreams were something that computers don't necessarily do, because from a technological standpoint, their memory consolidation is not like us. It's not associative like that, but it's also just they're not conscious, and they don't have the sense of mortality that would allow them to dream as such, or even use the word dream to begin with. And I mean, God, like you would even see it like, I mean, this is the plot point of like every science fiction thing, like in every sort of Star Trek episode where they go against like an artificial intelligence. And so it's just like, you know, how did you defeat the machine at its own game? And it'll always be, you know, it's just like, well, we defeated it with the only language it doesn't understand, love. You know, like that's they completely understand what that is. And now, you know, so now that my subconscious is not filled with a bunch of work emails and a bunch of pointless information, I do tend to notice that like the creative endeavors tend to increase considerably because I just simply have more intellectual freedom to persist with that. And poetry is very interesting to me. I think that it's, without going into gender war, I'd say that, well, I mean, I'm not a feminist, but I'm like a female realist, right? Which I always found kind of funny because, you know, if women let institutions and the patriarchy, even if they allow them to say that they have no fixed nature, even being told you have no fixed nature is still a nature and it's still an imposed structure. For me, all that I try to do is just see how women operate precisely as they do, and to be as realistic and as objective as I possibly can be about that. And the conclusion is genuine, is just they have a certain nature to them. And I found that, I think with women potentially being more coy and having even more skin in the game, especially emotionally, that I find that they sometimes use poetry, as beautiful as it is, to be sort of a way to communicate with the world that includes a certain amount of plausible deniability. Like they always have to be able to pull back on something if they get held to it, which I completely understand. So it becomes kind of like a Straussian sort of cipher for their internal world. And I mean, when you get a poem from a woman, or even read one that's read by them, it involves a lot of decoding, which is sort of a sacred process in and of itself. For me, I believe that the poetic register, it's okay. The one thing that I will say is that if you get a letter from me, and if I've written you anything personally, like I got this from a friend, and you could only communicate with her via letters. And there's this whole thing which is very interesting about it. It's just you can't just have like a continuous exchange of just pointless information. It's almost as though having things that have been worked on and thought about and experienced and then recalled in a letter and having to compress things into something reveals more than just if you're on the phone like all day just chattering with somebody. And to slow it down and to make it deeper makes it more like an old growth hardwood where the rings are very close together and it's quite strong, versus like a fast growth softwood that you would use for paper or toothpicks or something. So there's something about that. But if I write something personally, like I don't use AI, because it is poetry, and writing is one of the most human things possible. The creativity to generate that, you know, like an AI is trained on human beings, so we're ultimately the ultimate source. We are the creativity that this is meant to serve. And so it is pretty sacred and sacrosanct that personal writing have a sort of psychic residue on it. for it to include information that you didn't intend to put in there, like some kind of subtext, like some subconscious. And the decoding of that and the fact that other people do it subconsciously as well is like this very odd way for like the soul of one another to speak to each other. Like, I think that's very important. And so I noticed once I was involved in less pointless correspondence, and every time that my job became less tedious, I became more artistic. And so with poetry, I do find that I like lines will just come to me. I never actually really sit down and just think like, I want to say X, Y, and Z. It just, X, Y, and Z, it just comes to me. And I'll wake up with it, or I'll have lines just appear and then they'll slowly coalesce into something. So when we talk about the ability of a computer to write anything that is heartfelt, like that's why it feels like a massive violation to communicate with people where the artistic has been generated by artificial intelligence. If there's communication that again is meant to just relay information efficiently, I don't think that's anything worse. That's not worse than like calling somebody on the phone versus talking to them face to face. Whereas I think if you're communicating something deep, that's when it becomes a violation. So I think in there lies the ethical line between inauthentic communication facilitated by AI versus authentic communication. And that is a very important question. And I think that it's one that gets eclipsed by the job conversation, or just like the general distrust of technology question. So I actually wrote a poem, and I'm gonna use it as an example about like why this kind of communication it persists on, or it operates on a bunch of different layers. So it begins, I met you in a daydream in the place we both found. The trees bathed the wind and put the sound to bed. I doubted you were real. I spoke to watch your eyes receive it, took your hand to feel your form, put my hand to your breast to feel your heart, waited until dusk to see your breath paint the air. She was a pond reflecting everything. I cast a rock into its glass to see if her own waves rippled on the shore and in the grass. I hated to feel your presence and loved to feel your absence. Night wanders helplessly into dark and back to night again. The canopy of stars has lost their place, rearranging every twilight. The greed of youth takes all but its time. It's unsteady in its footing and breaks what it touches, sitting weeping in what it has shattered, searching again for its form whole again. This time it will hold, not seize. Sit beside, not shouting from behind. Loneliness falls like cotton fluff, collecting in memory like gold in river bends. It numbs your feet, waiting for a ride that never comes. It whips like winter wind through your threadbare stories of the past. It is sunlight that opens up the flowers and sets the sky alight. So when I think about something like that, there's this idea of there's embodiment and there's domesticity to it, and there's this process of growth and regret and apology and revelation after the fact. There's all of these different things that are sort of combined into this kind of spiral structure, and it's entirely based like this. This is a reduction, and it is it's a combination of subjective experiences. It's almost like consciousness that has been reversed. So consciousness is all this information that you're getting, and you can never perceive all the information that's coming to you at once, right? That's impossible. And so you have to make choices subconsciously. And your consciousness is essentially a whole bunch of choices and a whole bunch of collapses of ambiguity and like an imposition of structure, but then also presence. And there's this whole thing. And so what poetry is it is sort of like you take that lens of consciousness and then you reverse it, you invert it so that your internal experience gets thrown back out into the world, into this field of information. And then the process of your own consciousness is then absorbed into somebody else through their lens. And it's, when I talk about that sort of soul to soul communication, that's what I'm getting at. Like, you're not imposing a structure on it when you speak to somebody. If I say something to somebody, even if it's in a letter, it's still an imposed structure. But when you write poetry that is somewhat mysterious even to yourself, it is just the spontaneous creations of your subconscious. You're giving someone something that is completely pure to their experience. I mean, as much as you possibly can. And so, one, it's a call to say, like, it's absolutely important to write poetry, but it's also incredibly important to create the circumstance in which poetry can develop at all.